You're standing in a peat bog in central Denmark, and it's May of 1950, and two brothers cutting turf for fuel have just uncovered a face. The skin is dark and leathery, but the stubbles on the chin is still there. The eyelashes are still there. The workers are so certain they've found a murder victim that they call the police before they call anyone else. The police open a file, and then the file goes nowhere because the man in the bog has been dead for about 20,400 years. That's Tollund man. A rope is still cinched around his neck. His last meal, a plain porridge of barley and flax and weeds, is still sitting in his stomach, and the thing that should stop you cold isn't that he died. It's how carefully someone arranged him afterward. Eyes closed, legs folded, positioned like he was sleeping. He wasn't alone out there. Denmark, Germany, Ireland, and England have all given up bodies like his, preserved in the acid and the cold and the low oxygen of the bogs, well enough that forensic scientists 2,000 years later can tell you what these people ate for their final meal, whether they'd done manual labor, and exactly how they died. And once you start lining those deaths up side by side, a pattern starts to surface that has nothing to do with accident and everything to do with punishment, ritual, and a kind of judicial violence practiced by people we were taught had no law at all. We call this era prehistoric because there's no writing to explain it to us. No court transcripts, no confessions, no judge's name carved into a stele the way you get a few thousand years later with Hammurabi. Just bodies, bones, pits, and the marks left on them. And here's the thing people get wrong about that silence. They assume it means there was no system, no law, no punishment, no consequence. Just chaos and animal instinct until somebody eventually invented a courtroom. The forensic record says the opposite. It says the system was already there, fully operational, long before anyone had a word for justice. And in some ways it was more consistent, more procedural, and more permanent than anything we've built since. Modern prisons run on documents, sentencing guidelines, appeals, a release date circled on a calendar somewhere. What you're about to hear ran on something else entirely, on rope and stone and cold water, and the calculated placement of a corpse where the whole community would have to walk past it. 10 examples, starting with the man in the bog. And by the time you get to the last one, you'll understand why some archaeologists say the deepest layers of the human past are also the hardest ones to look at directly. Number 1, the triple death. Go back to that rope around Tollund man's neck. It wasn't just for show. Forensic examination in the decades since his discovery confirmed he was hanged. The noose pulled tight enough to leave a groove in the skin that survived 24 centuries. That alone would be enough to close the file. But Tollund man got off comparatively easy compared to what waited for other people in these same wetlands. Take Lindo man, pulled out of a bog in Cheshire, England, in 1984. Somebody fed him a burnt griddle cake laced with mistletoe pollen as what may have been his final meal. Then somebody hit him twice in the head, hard enough to fracture his skull. Then somebody garroted him with a cord, twisted tight enough to break his neck. Then somebody cut his throat. Then, and only then, they laid him face down in a pool of water to finish the job. Archaeologists have a name for this now. They call it the triple death, because a robber only needs to kill a man once, and whoever did this to Lindo man needed to kill him 3 separate ways in a row, like each method was a separate requirement that had to be checked off before the punishment counted as complete. Old Krogan man, found in an Irish bog in 2003, got it worse, stabbed in the chest, decapitated, cut in half at the waist. He was a giant for his era, close to 6.5 feet tall, with manicured hands that suggest he never did a day of physical labor in his life, which has led some archaeologists to wonder if he was a failed or deposed leader, punished specifically because of who he'd been, not despite it. And the Windaby body, found in a German bog in 1952 and long assumed to be a teenage girl blindfolded and drowned for some sexual transgression, was re-examined decades later and turned out to be a young man in his teens, drowned with one arm hacked away, the old story about the crime rewritten the moment the science caught up with the bones. And it keeps going. Groball man, pulled from a Danish bog in 1952, had his throat slit from ear to ear so violently that the cut nearly reached his spine, and his stomach still held the porridge of 60 different plant species, including enough ergot fungus to have left him delirious or half unconscious before the blade ever touched him. eyed girl, found in the Netherlands, was strangled with her own woolen belt, wound 3 times around her neck. Herxheim woman was garroted. The Khausen boy, a teenager barely into adolescence, was hogtied at the wrists and ankles before he died, his body folded into a position no living person chooses for themselves. Here's what should unsettle you about all of this. None of this violence was hidden. It wasn't tucked away in a shallow grave somebody hoped nobody would find. Old Krogon man and Herxheim woman were both pinned in place after death with wooden stakes and hurdles woven from branches, physically anchored to the bottom of the bog so the body couldn't drift or resurface. These weren't casual disposals. They were engineered. The punishment wasn't private. It was a fixture of the landscape, a place a whole community knew was there and knew exactly what it meant to be walked out into. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing centuries later about the tribes of Germania, described a practice of drowning certain offenders in bogs and pinning them under wicker frames, and for a long time historians treated that as folklore. Then the peat cutters started finding bodies pinned under wicker frames, exactly where Tacitus said they'd be. Number 2, the bound woman of Nataruk. Every body so far has come from a bog in Europe, from a settled world with villages and crops, and something we'd recognize as a justice system, however brutal. Now go back further. Go back 10,000 years, to a marshy lagoon near Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, to a group of people who had no farms, no permanent settlements, nothing but fish and wild game and each other. This is supposed to be the version of humanity untouched by law, too small and too mobile for anything like organized punishment. That is not what the ground at Nataruk says. In 2012, a Cambridge University team excavating the site found the remains of at least 27 people, and it did not take long to work out what had happened to them. 10 of the 12 most complete skeletons showed unmistakable violence. 5 had been struck in the skull hard enough to crush it. 5 had arrow wounds to the head and neck, in 2 cases with the stone points still lodged in the bone. Hands, knees, ribs, all broken. And in several cases, the position of the wrists and ankles told the team something even harder to look at. These people had been bound before they died. One of them was a woman in the final stage of pregnancy. She was found reclining on one elbow, fractures across her knees, her wrists crossed, in a position consistent with having been tied. She was surrounded by fish bones from the meal she'd been having when it happened. There is no trial here. No accusation, no confession, no ruling handed down by an elder or a chief. What Nataruk gives you instead is the oldest scientifically dated evidence of organized group violence against fellow humans on Earth, roughly 10,000 years old, which means the impulse to bind a person, kill them, and leave them exposed on the ground rather than bury them predates farming, predates writing, predates the wheel. It was already fully formed before civilization as we define it had even started. Marta Mirazon-Lar, the paleoanthropologist who led the excavation, put the intent plainly. This wasn't a fight that spiraled out of control between 2 individuals. It was a coordinated, lethal attack aimed at people who could not fight back, and people who were of no use to whoever did this. A description that covers a heavily pregnant woman and a group of 6 children found near the other adult women. Not every researcher agrees on the label. A team at Arizona State University later pushed back on the massacre interpretation, arguing some of the damage might reflect natural post-mortem processes rather than a single coordinated slaughter, and that disagreement is worth including honestly rather than pretending the science is settled. But even the skeptics don't dispute the bound wrists, the arrow points still lodged in bone, or the fact that 27 people ended up dead together on the edge of that lagoon and nobody came back to bury a single one of them. We like to imagine that punishment, law, and order arrived with cities. Nataruk says the opposite. The capacity for organized, deliberate violence against your own kind, aimed specifically at the people least able to defend themselves, was already sitting there in the hunter-gatherer toolkit, fully assembled, 10 millennia before anyone built the first wall to keep it out. Number 3, the Talheim Pit. If Nataruk shows the impulse in its rawest form, Talheim shows what happens when that impulse gets organized at scale. And it happens in a place that's supposed to be the beginning of peaceful civilization, an early farming village. In 1983, construction workers in southwestern Germany hit something in a garden near the town of Talheim. It turned out to be a circular pit about 7 meters across, and inside it were the tangled remains of 34 people, men, women, children, all members of the linear Bankeramic culture, Europe's very first farmers, and all killed in what forensic analysts now describe as execution-style violence roughly 7,000 years ago. The skulls show repeated blunt force trauma, blow after blow, delivered by weapons that match tools used by the LBK culture itself, not raiders from some unknown outside group. Neighbors, people who farmed the same crops, spoke the same language, worshipped the same way. And the deposition of the bodies wasn't careful. There was no ceremony, no grave goods, no shroud. Just 34 people shoved into a hole and left. If you're the kind of person who wants the version of these stories that keeps every uncomfortable detail instead of sanding it down for a family-friendly narration, subscribe now, because this is only the third entry, and the ones after it get considerably harder to sit with. What Talheim tells you is that the very first farming societies in Europe, the people we credit with inventing settled civilization, had already invented mass execution to go along with it. Some researchers connect Talheim to competition for land and resources between rival farming communities, the same pressures that would drive war for the next 7,000 years, just arriving earlier than anyone expected. Others point to isotope analysis on the bones, showing that some of the dead, particularly younger women, weren't locals at all but had grown up elsewhere, eating a different diet as children than the diet found in the local soil and water. That detail raises a genuinely disturbing possibility. This might not have been a single, isolated massacre at all, but the violent settling of a much older score, retaliation against a community that had itself taken people by force from somewhere else at an earlier point in time. If that's right, then the pit at Talheim isn't the beginning of a story. It's the ending of one we can no longer read the first half of. Ceramic analysis places the site's activity within a compressed window of less than 50 years, which tells you the massacre wasn't a single freak event in an otherwise peaceful landscape. It happened within a narrow, active period of conflict between neighboring LBK groups, the same culture, the same tools, the same crops, turning on each other. Either way, the pit at Talheim sat undisturbed under a garden for 7,000 years, and it took a construction crew with a shovel in 1983 to make the world's first farmers answer for what they did to each other. Number 4. The Hamstrung children of Kilianstädten. Talheim wasn't a one-off. The same linear Bankeramic culture left behind at least 2 more mass graves in Germany and Austria, and one of them contains a detail so specific and so deliberate that archaeologists have struggled to explain it as anything other than a targeted, punitive act carried out on people who were still alive when it happened. At Schöneck Kilianstädten, excavators found the remains of at least 26 people, again predominantly LBK farmers, again killed with the same pattern of skull trauma seen at Talheim. But this time, researchers identified something new layered on top of the killing: the deliberate destruction of the lower leg bones on a number of the victims, damage inflicted in the same window of time as the fatal wounds, meaning it happened at or near the moment of death, rather than afterward, as some kind of ritual defacement of a corpse. In plain terms, before or as these people were being killed, someone methodically broke their shins. There's a grim, practical logic that some researchers have floated for this. A shattered leg doesn't just injure a person, it removes any possibility that they crawl away, limp away, or fight back while the rest of the group is being dealt with. It's not a byproduct of the violence. It's a targeted incapacitation, done with intent, done to make sure the punishment landed on every single person in the group, and that nobody slipped out the back of the massacre alive. And remember that this happened to children as well as adults. The excavators at these LBK sites consistently found the bones of the very young mixed in among the rest. No separation, no mercy built into the pattern at all. What makes this entry different from the bog bodies and from Nataruk is the coldness of the calculation. This isn't rage. This isn't a raid that got out of hand. This is someone taking the time, in the middle of killing an entire community, to make a specific tactical decision about how to keep every one of them from escaping. That is not chaos. That is procedure. Number 5. Herxheim's ditches. Now the pattern gets stranger, because the next site doesn't look like a massacre at all. it looks like a monument, and what was done to the bodies inside it took time, skill, and an enormous amount of deliberate, repeated ritual that stretched on for years, maybe decades. Herxheim, in the German region of Rhineland-Palatinate, is a circular enclosure surrounded by 2 ditches, and inside those ditches archaeologists have recovered the remains of more than 450 people, not intact skeletons laid to rest, fragments, at least 173 skulls and skull plates deliberately separated from the rest of the body, deposited at regular intervals around the ditch in a pattern too consistent to be accidental. The bones show cut marks and breakage consistent with defleshing, the deliberate removal of soft tissue from the bone, and some researchers who've studied the marks argue they're consistent with cannibalism, while others push back and say the same damage could come from a non-dietary practice of ritually stripping and processing the dead. What both sides agree on is that this was not a burial. It was a systematic, long-running program of taking human bodies apart according to a fixed set of rules and placing the pieces exactly where the ritual demanded. Here's the detail that should really sit with you. Herxheim isn't a one-time massacre pit like Talheim. The evidence points to this having happened repeatedly, over an extended period, which means this wasn't a single outburst of violence. It was a recurring institution. Somebody, or some group, in Neolithic Europe was regularly bringing bodies to this specific enclosure, and regularly performing the same complicated, multi-step process on them for long enough that it left a signature 450 individuals deep. Whether the people processed at Herxheim were captives, criminals, sacrificial volunteers, or casualties of some crisis at the end of the LBK culture is still debated, and probably always will be. Some researchers who've examined the cut marks up close describe patterns consistent with the deliberate stripping of flesh from bone shortly after death, the kind of butchery pattern you'd expect if the goal was consumption rather than simple decoration of a ritual space. Other specialists argue just as forcefully that the same marks could result from a purely symbolic defleshing ritual with no consumption involved at all, a performance of violence against the dead, rather than an actual meal. Notice that both interpretations, the more clinical one and the far darker one, still agree on the baseline fact. Hundreds of human bodies were deliberately taken apart, piece by piece, according to rules precise enough to repeat identically across 4.5 centuries worth of deposits. But look what it tells you, regardless of which interpretation you land on. By the Neolithic, a farming society in the heart of Europe had already built a permanent site, visited again and again over years, specifically for the ritualized dismantling of human bodies. Punishment, sacrifice, or something in between, it required infrastructure. It required people who knew the procedure well enough to repeat it correctly every time, the way you'd train an apprentice into any other skilled trade. Somebody built that ditch on purpose and used it on purpose, over and over, for longer than most of us will live. Number 6, the Halberstadt Line. Here's where the story shifts from ambiguous ritual violence to something archaeologists are now willing to call, in plain language, an execution. At Halberstadt in Germany, researchers examined a Neolithic mass grave and found a pattern of skull injuries that was too uniform, too clustered, and too consistent to fit the usual signature of a chaotic battle or a raid. Instead of wounds scattered across different parts of the head, the way you'd expect from people actively fighting and defending themselves in different directions, the trauma at Halberstadt clusters tightly, blow after blow landing in the same region of the skull, on victim after victim. The interpretation that's emerged from that pattern is stark. These people weren't killed in combat. They were made to kneel, or made to stand still, and struck down one after another in a controlled, methodical sequence. That's not a massacre in the heat of the moment. That's a line of people being processed. There's a companion site worth mentioning here too. At Aspern an der Zaya in Austria, where the bodies in the enclosure ditch show carnivore gnaw marks and partial disarticulation that happened before the ditch ever silted over naturally, meaning these people, like the ones at Nataruk half a world away and thousands of years earlier, were left exposed to scavengers before the earth finally closed over them. Researchers studying Aspern also noted something the other sites didn't show as clearly. a disproportionate number of younger women missing from the pattern of violence altogether, which has led some to argue that certain individuals weren't killed at all but taken, absorbed into whatever group carried out the attack. A grim asterisk on an already grim picture, calm Halberstadt, with Talheim and Kilianstädten and Herxheim and Asparn. And you get a picture of early Neolithic Europe that has nothing to do with the peaceful, sun-dappled version of the first farmers you might picture from a museum diorama. What you get instead is a network of sites spread across Germany and Austria, spanning centuries, all showing the same underlying capability. Organized groups capable of overpowering, restraining, and systematically killing dozens of their own kind at a time, and doing it with enough repetition and enough consistency that specific execution methods start to show up again and again in the bones, the way a signature style shows up across a killer's body of work. This wasn't invented once. It was a set of practices, refined and reused, in a Europe that had barely finished inventing agriculture. Number 7, the threshold children. This next one is harder to talk about. And archaeologists themselves argue constantly about how to interpret it, so I want to give you exactly what the evidence shows, and exactly where the uncertainty begins. Across a number of Neolithic settlement sites in Europe and the Near East, excavators have repeatedly found the remains of infants and very young children buried not in cemeteries alongside adults, but under the floors and thresholds of houses, sometimes clustered near walls, sometimes positioned in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than an ordinary grave. In some of the same cultures that produced the massacre sites and the ritual enclosures already on this list, infant mortality was brutally high to begin with, and the most straightforward explanation for many of these burials is exactly that. Grieving families keeping their youngest dead close to the hearth rather than sending them out to a separate burial ground. That's the majority interpretation, and it deserves to be said plainly, because it's the responsible one. But a smaller number of these burials don't fit that pattern cleanly. Some show the same kind of unusual positioning, restraint, or associated ritual deposits that mark the deviant and revenant burials found across the same regions, and in a handful of documented cases from the broader ancient world, researchers have pointed to associations between foundation deposits and structures being built or renewed, raising the uncomfortable question of whether some of these small bodies represent a specific, purposeful act tied to the building itself rather than an ordinary death handled with love. This is the entry on the list where the evidence is thinnest and the interpretations are most contested. And any honest account of prehistoric punishment has to tell you that up front, rather than dressing uncertainty up as fact. What's not in dispute is that these societies treated the placement of a child's body as something loaded with meaning, something that could be used to mark, protect, or consecrate a structure in a way an adult burial in a normal cemetery never was. Number 8, the Revenant Graves. Every punishment so far ended when the person died. This next one didn't. This is the punishment that kept going after the body was already in the ground, because the people burying it were afraid the dead person wasn't actually finished. Across Europe, from the Neolithic all the way through the medieval period, archaeologists keep encountering what they call deviant burials, and a specific subset of them fits an unmistakable pattern. The body is placed face down in the grave instead of face up. Heavy stones, sometimes boulders, are set directly onto the chest, the abdomen, or the limbs. In some cases, the head has been removed after death and placed between the legs or behind the back. In a Roman-British burial at Stanwick in Northamptonshire, the corpse was found face down with its tongue cut out and replaced by a flat stone wedged into the mouth. In Bulgaria, archaeologists have found centuries-old skeletons with iron rods driven straight through the chest. In Germany, a recently excavated grave has been identified by the excavation team themselves as a textbook example of what they call a revenant burial. Someone dead, so feared by the living that extraordinary physical measures were taken to make absolutely certain they stayed in the ground. The logic behind this, preserved in later folklore that almost certainly reaches back to much older beliefs, is disturbingly literal. A body buried face down can't find its way back up through the earth, because the moment it starts digging, it digs itself deeper. A body pinned under a boulder set on the chest can't sit up, and can't claw its way out of the grave. A body with its head detached and displaced, sometimes tucked behind the knees or wedged under an arm, can't reanimate and go looking for the rest of itself. A mouth blocked with a flat stone can't speak a curse, can't call out to the living, can't even breathe if breath is somehow what's animating it from the inside. In Norse tradition, this reanimated thing has a name, the Draugr, described in the sagas as a corporeal revenant that keeps the full physical weight and strength of the person it used to be, radiating cold and the stench of decay, capable of crushing the roof of a house or slaughtering livestock in a single night. You don't build defenses like this against a ghost. You build them against something the diggers were convinced still had a body. This is punishment not necessarily for a crime committed in life, but for the threat a person's very corpse was believed to represent, a preemptive strike against a return nobody wanted to risk. Archaeologist Eileen Murphy, who has spent years cataloging these atypical burials, notes that the same treatment was applied across history to a strikingly consistent list: convicted criminals, women who died in childbirth, unbaptized infants, people with visible disabilities, and anyone the community had already marked as different before they even died. Being buried this way wasn't only about what you'd done. Sometimes it was only about what you were, and it wasn't confined to prehistory. In Scotland, a man named Farquhar Shaw troubled his neighborhoods so badly in life that when he died in 1405, 5 heavy stone slabs, described locally as kebbucks, cheese-shaped rocks, were laid flat across his tombstone to keep him under. His grave still sits today on the Rothiemurchus estate, enclosed inside an iron cage, a mort safe, built specifically to stop anyone from ever lifting those stones off him again. 600 years later, nobody in that village has volunteered to be the one who finds out if the precaution was necessary. Number 9. The ones never buried at all. Go back to Nataruk for a moment, to that pregnant woman with her wrists bound. There's a detail about that site that gets easy to skip past once you've absorbed the violence of it, and it might be the cruelest part of the whole picture. None of those 27 people were buried. Not one. They were found exactly where they fell, scattered across the mud of a dried lagoon bed, left exposed to the sun and the animals and the slow work of 10,000 years of sediment. Whoever killed them didn't just take their lives. They denied them the single thing every human culture we know of, going back further than almost anything else, treats as sacred, a grave. That denial shows up again and again once you know to look for it. At the massacre sites in Austria, some remains show gnaw marks from scavenging animals and partial disarticulation that happened before natural burial ever occurred, meaning the bodies lay out in the open long enough for wildlife to get to them first. Across dozens of prehistoric cultures worldwide, ethnographic and archaeological evidence converges on the same idea from different directions. The harshest thing you could do to a person, sometimes worse in the mind of that culture than killing them, was to make certain their body was never properly laid to rest. No ceremony, no return to the ancestors, no place for the living to visit or the dead to settle. Just an open field, and whatever the weather and the wildlife decided to do with what was left. This is a punishment with no upper limit because it doesn't end at death the way execution does. It continues indefinitely, for as long as the bones lie there unclaimed, which, in the case of the people at Nataruk, turned out to be 10,000 years, until a team of archaeologists finally carefully gave them the attention nobody bothered to give them at the time. Think about what that means for the pregnant woman with her wrists bound. Every single human culture we have any record of, going back to the very edge of what we can study, treats the dead with some form of deliberate ritual. A position, a direction the body faces, an object placed in the hand. Whoever left her exactly where she fell wasn't just failing to bury her. They were making a statement by refusing to do it, telling anyone who came looking that she and the others with her didn't merit even that minimum, universal act of care. Number 10. The punishment that outlived everyone. Look at what's actually connecting all 9 of these, because it isn't the specific method. Strangulation, drowning, blunt trauma, deliberate mutilation, ritual dismemberment, execution in a line, exposure under stone, exposure under open sky. Every method is different. What's identical across every single one of them is this. Somebody made a choice about how a body would be treated, and that choice was meant to send a message to everyone still alive to see it. That's the through line running underneath this entire list, and it's the reason the story doesn't actually end in prehistory. The fear that drove people to weight a corpse down with stone at Herxheim's era didn't stay in the Neolithic. It walked straight through the Iron Age of the bog bodies, through the Roman period at Stanwick, through the medieval world, and it was still active enough in Scotland in the year 1405 that a community sealed a man's grave under an iron cage to keep the stones on his chest from ever being disturbed. That cage is still standing. You can go look at it today. Modern prisons, whatever you think of them, run on the idea that punishment ends. There's a sentence, and eventually, for almost everyone, there's a release date, a return to some version of ordinary life, a body that gets buried by people who loved it when the whole thing is finally over. Almost none of what you've just heard worked that way. The bog victims were sunk somewhere. The entire community would keep walking past for generations. The Nataruk dead were left in the open with no ceremony at all for 10,000 years, until strangers with brushes and tape measures finally did the job nobody else had. The Revenant dead were punished specifically so their punishment would never be allowed to end, pinned under rock in perpetuity, by people who were terrified of what would happen the moment anyone let up. We call this era prehistoric because nobody wrote any of it down, but the bones did the writing instead, in a script more permanent than ink, and it's still legible today, in bogs, in pits, in ditches, and under a caged grave in the Scottish Highlands that a village sealed shut 600 years ago, and nobody has dared to open since. And notice something else while you're sitting with all 10 of these. Every single one of them was found by accident. Peat cutters looking for fuel, construction workers digging a foundation, farmers clearing a garden. Nobody set out looking for evidence of prehistoric punishment and found it on purpose. It kept surfacing on its own, decade after decade, site after site, on 3 different continents, because there is simply so much of it in the ground that you cannot dig very far in most of the world without eventually hitting some version of this same story. That should tell you something about the scale of what we're actually talking about. 10 entries on this list, thousands more, almost certainly, still exactly where they were left, waiting on the next shovel. So, tell me down in the comments which one of these 10 got to you the most, and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more of the history that gets left out of the tidy version, the one where prehistoric people were simple, and the real cruelty only started with civilization, subscribe, because there is a lot more sitting in the ground, still waiting to be dug up.